You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 22nd of April, 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The IMF portends global economic gloom, the enduring soft power of the papacy, and has Pete Hegseth copied you in on any classified military operations? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Giorgia Scaturro and Charles Hecker will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the Norwegian think tank pitching a remedy for the failures of globalisation. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and we will hear from Giorgia Scaturro and Charles Hecker shortly. But first, the International Monetary Fund has passed judgment on the likely global economic impact of US President Donald Trump's tariffs, and it would appear that it is not only the penguins of the Heard and McDonald Islands who will suffer. The IMF suggested that stock markets could have further distance to tumble, and that even if substantial numbers of countries do manage to flatter or bribe their way out from under Trump's tariffs, the global economy is likely to limp along slowly for a while yet. Well, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Rajesh Mirchandani, communications executive and journalist. Rajesh, is this in general uncharacteristically gloomy of the IMF?
Well, uncharacteristically gloomy. I mean, we've had some very difficult years, Andrew, haven't we? I mean, the IMF today said that the global economy hasn't still even recovered from the pandemic. And it certainly had its share of bleak forecasts in the past. What was interesting about this was that it, in no uncertain terms, said, as a result of the US imposing the highest in a century tariffs and the policy uncertainty that this causes, that's why it is downgrading its forecast from just 3 months ago, lopping off entirely 0.5 percentage point of expected growth from its forecast in January to its forecast now. So uncharacteristically gloomy, I don't know. Gloomy, absolutely.
Does it vary significantly between countries/regions? Yeah.
It does. So, the global growth estimates have been revised down from 3.3% for this year down to 2.8% for this year. It does vary, though. In the US, the IMF expects growth to be down this year to just 1.8%. That's almost an entire percentage point lower than they were forecasting in January. They're actually not forecasting a recession in the US, which is interesting, because it says the US economy has strong underlying performance with things like low unemployment and cooling inflation. This is a little at odds with other organizations, one of which at least today said that there was going to be a small recession in the US. But the point is, who knows? The IMF's opening words in the press conference today were the global economic system under which most countries have operated for the last 80 years is being reset, which basically means buckle up, world. So outside of the US, other big countries, it downgraded its forecast for Chinese growth down to 4%, showing that China is still growing, but downgrading that too. It's also downgraded Eurozone growth. It's already sluggish, but they're now saying that European economies will grow at about 0.8% this year. That's down just 0.2% because many European countries aren't facing the steepest tariffs. It has downgraded the UK's growth as well, but says that's still going to be at about 1% in 2025, which is in line with what the UK's own economists are saying, and is interestingly the highest of the European G7 nations. Mexico, I'm just going to give you that very briefly. The IMF is actually saying that in terms of the big economies, Mexico is the one that's it foresees a potential economic contraction in 2025.
Did the IMF have any counsel to impart to a bemused world other than buckle up? There has been a lot of talk, for obvious reasons, in recent weeks about how countries might operate around or without the United States if it decides to absent itself from its traditional position at the heart of global trade. Does the IMF have any ideas about how that might be practically enacted?
So I just want to start off by saying, buckle up is me paraphrasing. The IMF didn't use that phrase. Sadly, that might have been really interesting. The IMF also did not say you should figure out how to work around the US. What it is recommending, as you would expect, a global organization to do, especially one that is in Washington, D.C., and that is currently being reviewed by the Trump administration, it is saying the countries really need to increase cooperation to restore certainty to global trade. And that means, let's not have this wild west of who's going to impose tariffs on who and how long are they going to last. But can countries at least have some idea with some time horizon of certainty that this is going to be the state in 6, 9, 12, 18 months? And can actually countries work towards reducing those trade barriers? It also recommended very strongly that in order to minimize the impacts of these tariffs, monetary policy needs to remain agile so that countries can really respond in terms of their interest rates as their economies are roiled now and then maybe in the future. What it means, the IMF did say, is that central banks need to retain their independence because their credibility is based on their independence. And that, I think, puts them pretty much at odds with what President Trump has been saying recently.
Rajesh Mirchandani at the IMF in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined for the rest of the show by Giorgia Scaturro, London-based Italian reporter and producer, and Charles Hecker, senior partner at Control Risks, author most recently of, Charles, that title again.
Zero Sum, the Arc of International Business in Russia.
Which you have just been shilling in your home country.
That's right. I've done a little bit of a book publicity tour running up and down the East Coast with a little side trip to the great state of Texas.
And how are things over there, Charles? How would you say it's all going?
In a word, chaotic. And a country sort of evenly split between thinking this too shall pass, and the other half of the country thinking we need to panic, we just don't know how much.
A subject to which we will be returning later in the show, and by way of queuing up another subject to which we will be returning later in the show, Giorgia, I cannot even begin to imagine what this week has been like for an Italian reporter.
It's unimaginable, in fact. I can say
literally so.
Nerve-wracking, heartbreaking. And we're obviously talking about the Pope. So for 11 years, Easter Day for me is my appointment with the Pope, or as part of the team at the BBC, broadcasting his Urbi et Orbi message and blessing to the world and to the UK. He's always quite busy, but this year we really didn't know what to expect. So lots of preparation beforehand to check the steps that the Pope would take. He's very convalescent. He was very ill. Nobody would know whether he would have attended the biggest moment in Christianity, and one event on St. Peter's Square that he particularly treasure being amongst his people. So until the very last minute in that studio of the BBC, not knowing precisely whether he would have appeared and whether he would have said a few words was extremely nerve-wracking. And when he did appear out of the balcony, for a moment, it's like the time stopped and we saw him cropping up to the balcony on his wheelchair and then eventually reaching out to the microphone. But then the nerves went down to the heart because it was very difficult to hear what he was saying. And so we knew by then that the Pope wasn't very well at all.
Well, we will be returning to that subject later in the show, but first, here in London, the latest instalment of what has felt these last few months like a more or less continuous Ukraine peace summit will convene tomorrow. This one will be attended by Ukraine, the UK, the United States and France, and appears more or less a response to the latest American idea for forging a ceasefire, which includes telling Russia it can keep Crimea, at the very least, and telling Ukraine it can't join NATO, which does, on the face of it, seem abject surrender to Moscow-ish. Charles, first of all, the baleful I guess, more pessimistic analysis of that US pitch would be that it is exactly that, i.e. abject surrender to Moscow. But is there any chance at all this is one of those things you sort of throw out there to see if anybody else has any better ideas?
Yes, except that nobody does. And so we've got Ukraine, U.S., U.K., and France meeting to discuss, a peace or at the very least a ceasefire. Guess who's missing from this conversation? And that is Russia. President Putin has said that he is willing now to engage in direct talks with Ukraine, which is a slight change in his approach. Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky haven't met, I don't think, since 2019, if I'm not mistaken. I might be mistaken on that. It's been a number of years, and of course the two sides have refused to meet. But there's really, sadly, there's just nothing new here. The United States, in addition to sort of throwing out whatever it might in the way of proposals, is also throwing out the suggestion that it will just sort of throw its toys out of the pram and abandon talks for a settlement at all. There is considerable, having just returned from the United States, there is considerable fatigue in Washington on dealing with Ukraine. First, there was war fatigue. And now there's peace talks fatigue. The president has an extremely limited attention span. He gets bored very easily. This subject is rapidly becoming very boring to him. This may be one of the last times that the United States participates in these sorts of talks.
Which does prompt the question, Giorgia, to what extent is what we're witnessing here basically Europe desperately trying to keep the United States involved in European affairs, even if this isn't actually doing much for Ukraine?
Well, what we know at the moment is that tomorrow we're expected to see this plan that Ukraine, France and UK have worked on to halt the hostilities and to make sure that there is a durable peace. But this plan will have to be submitted to the US. So it seems like we can't do much unless the US is on board. And even, we've seen that so far the project coalition of the Willings that Starmer had launched together with Macron, and that was somehow criticized by Trump, who wasn't on board, is gradually turning into a plan of a military nature. So we have now Starmer with New Zealand and Australia and Canada. They are working on a 30 million weapons deal to train, send troops to train the Ukrainian troops. So that means we sort of seeing some diversion into the original plan, and that Europe is also somehow coming along. Let's not forget that the UK has sent 752 million fund for military equipment to Ukraine, and this will be paid by the profits of sanctioned assets from the EU. And so somehow we're working in the direction of a peace that we assume will be there with the US on board, hopefully, and in which, after which, we won't be able, as the West, to control on the ground, but will be controlled by Ukrainian troops themselves.
Charles, it strikes me at least that the question everybody is very, very keen not to answer is the question of, if you're Vladimir Putin, considering the current situation, absent the prospect of actually losing this war, like getting actually properly smashed and chased out of Ukraine all the way back to your own borders, why would you stop fighting?
Well, precisely right. You wouldn't. And the primary driver on Putin's side in this conflict is to keep going. And that will undermine any sort of talks or arrangements or agreements. Putin has yet really to negotiate in good faith with any of his counterparts. I mean, that has been primarily President Trump, who I think he has played like a fiddle since the beginning of these talks. The first phone call between Putin and Trump, and then the first meeting between Rubio and Lavrov, the U.S. Secretary of State, and the Russian Foreign Minister in Riyadh. Both of those events have repeated themselves. There have been two such meetings, and not in any of those meetings or negotiations or in any of the parallel talks taking place in Istanbul has the Russian side negotiated in earnest or sincerely. And you're absolutely right. He is not winning this war in any stretch of the imagination. He's doing better than Ukraine. He's doing better than Russia had done in the past. There's very little chance, though, of him being chased out of the country, and it is absolutely to his benefit, and it is a primary driver for him to stay engaged.
And just finally on this, Giorgia, do you detect, and obviously Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni was a recent visitor to the White House, any new ideas that the Europeans have for trying to keep Donald Trump and the United States interested, or might we start to be getting to the point at which Europe just decides we do have to do this by ourselves?
Well, it looks like the only words that he really cares for and listens to is money, investments, increase in military expenditure, and that's what Giorgia Meloni played the card well. She promised investment. She couldn't speak on behalf of Europe, but she promised that somehow the expenses in defense would go up, and that's what really is keeping Trump engaged.
Well, to the United States now, which as of this broadcast appears determined to keep learning the hard way that such skills as are required to host weekend morning television are not necessarily exportable to overseeing the mightiest military force ever wielded. US Secretary of Defense, as of this broadcast, Pete Hegseth, appears to have been implicated in another group chat, breezily sharing details of military operations with people who arguably did not, strictly speaking, need to know them, such as his wife, brother and lawyer. Charles, I'm starting to feel quite left out at this point. Has Pete Hegseth copied you in on any classified military operations?
You know, try as I might to get involved in these WhatsApp chats, it's all come to naught.
Signal, Charles. That's where you're going wrong.
Did I say? Oh, no wonder. I'm sending the wrong messages. You're right. No, I've been left out, and I'm feeling quite offended because it seems that everybody else, as you pointed out, is involved in these conversations, and the circle keeps growing. What we're worried about here is a few things. First of all, if this is what he's doing in his conversations about how to attack the Houthis, you have to wonder how many other signal chats are out there on how many other topics and with how many other people who really don't have any business knowing this. The White House comes back and says that none of this is classified information. That's sort of putting language on trial a little bit. It's sensitive information that other people really don't need to know about. The Pentagon is in enormous chaos, and why shouldn't it be? Every other part of the U.S. government is in a deep state of disarray, from the State Department to the Justice Department, the IRS, a slight giggle up the sleeves at that one, and the FBI, and the list keeps going. So why shouldn't the Pentagon be in disarray? And what makes it so special? We have a Secretary of Defense who doesn't understand the currency of information and its meaning and its weight and its value. And I really wonder what his wife and brother have to say in this conversation.
Well, Giorgia, in fairness to Pete Hegseth, which is not a phrase I utter lightly, his brother and his lawyer at least do both work at the Department of Defense, but that doesn't really get him off the hook, does it?
Well, depends on what let's agree on what language are we going to use, because as Charles pointed out, classified information was as classified information is. A CV, what is a CV is, because I'm not sure that Pete Hegseth has the right CV as a Fox host to be.
Has he copied you in on these chats, Giorgia?
I am very glad to say I am not copied in. I would feel one of them, at this point. But going back to your question, at this point, we don't know what to expect. We just know that Donald Trump is completely behind him, saying he's doing a great job. Let's ask the Houthi that. We just have to put up with him until what could happen. He has another mishaps with Elon Musk. We know that, while Donald Trump is trying to increase the defense budget, Elon Musk is trying to cut down expenses. So these two men are at odds with each other. Let's see who will prevail on the scale of Mr. Donald Trump.
But Charles, I think we can assure ourselves, can we not, that if something like this happened during a Democratic administration from a Secretary of Defense appointed by a Democratic president, I'm absolutely sure, as we all can be, that the Republican Party would say, as they are saying now, this isn't that big a deal. I don't know why everyone's getting all that excited. We all make mistakes. Nothing to see here. They certainly would not be calling at the top of their voices for investigations, resignations, impeachments and arrests.
No, although I kind of rush to add that most of the people that the Democrats under the Biden administration, most of the people that they appointed to cabinet level positions were actually qualified for the job. You may argue that they were better or less qualified or, had some sort of element in their past that made them undesirable as a candidate or, they were appointed by, radical left liberals. But they were qualified for the job. The problem is that President Trump has appointed individuals whose primary criterion for the job is their loyalty to him rather than their skill as a secretary of an important cabinet role. If this had happened to the Democrats, the Republicans would be absolutely incandescent.
And seriously, they'd be right to be.
Yeah. And, the Democrats gave it a go at being incandescent with rage at Hegseth, but the Democrats really can't do very much of anything right now. We're in sort of, piss up in a brewery territory with the Democratic Party at the moment. And so, yes, everyone expresses outrage when the shoe is on the other foot. As Giorgia said, it's up to Trump, and he is forever the audience of one in these situations. There are rumors circulating around Washington that the administration is looking for a new Secretary of Defense, sort of quietly behind the scenes. We'll see how much longer. Hegseth is clearly on the bubble. We'll see how much longer he can hang on.
Although, just finally on that, Charles, and just quickly, because this is the depressing analysis or the suspicion that some people have is that Hegseth, for all his manifold deficiencies, is being kept in because those deficiencies are leverage over him at such time where Donald Trump orders him to call out the U.S. military against U.S. citizens.
Oh, that would be really tricky. The United States military is not supposed to be used on the territory of the United States. And so if you get that far, whether it's because Trump has an axe hold, swinging over Hegseth's head and is ready to drop it. If we're at that point already, something very, very seriously has gone wrong with the command over the army in the U.S. Hegseth or not.
Well, to Italy, which for obvious reasons will be commanding considerable global attention over the next few weeks. Though the reasons for this are melancholy, the focus on a papal funeral and the papal succession is a reminder of the extraordinary soft power cachet of the papacy. Listeners who write in to observe that technically none of this is happening in Italy, as the Vatican is a separate sovereign state, will not be thanked for their input. By some estimates, searches for flights to Rome have surged nearly 400% since the announcement of Pope Francis's passing, although somewhat amazingly, as of an hour or so ago, and I checked, return flights from London to Rome for this weekend could still be had for circa 150 quid, and hotels do also appear actually pretty reasonable. That is correct as of right now. If you're listening to this on podcast later, I cannot necessarily help you. Giorgia, I realise this is probably an impossible question to answer concisely, but is it possible to sort of give some idea of how big a part of Italy's considerable soft power imprint the papacy is?
Well, I would say soft power and strong power, not to say hard power, because the Vatican being in the heart of Rome, obviously we share spiritual, historical legacy, but also political. One of the, I think, a great achievement of Pope Francis was to somehow detach the church from a longer history of dark powers behind the church that have fed into literature, thrillers and crime from books and films and all the conspiracy around the church, because intrinsically the Vatican and the political powers in Italy have been intertwined for centuries. But with this Pope, we've seen a renewal. We've seen, for instance, the finances, the dark finances of the church. There's been a great attempt from the Pope to sort that matter out and to make some changes that would somehow make the church seems more transparent and hence a softer power, if you like, when it will all become about the poor and the outcast. In the light of humility, humanity, those are new words that are coming out from the church as opposed to from the opulent vestments to the secretive finances of the church has always been very a mystery. So I think, that's why we can talk of soft powers now as opposed to hidden powers in the past.
Charles, we were trying to think, are there other comparable institutions, venerable, mystical, which compel such global attention, even among people who may not be thought of as the flock, as in like millions, billions of non-Catholics will be gripped by events in the Vatican over the next few weeks? Is the British monarchy a comparable sort of thing?
I was sort of going to go there and harken back to the days of Princess Diana's untimely death and funeral and the outpouring of not just, uncharacteristically heartfelt and sort of public emotional British mourning, but really global mourning.
But there was a shock attached to that as well, because she was only 37, if memory serves.
That's right.
Whereas, obviously it is sad when an 88-year-old dies. It's not really... It doesn't have that same sort of jolt.
That's right. You're right. Princess Diana died tragically and prematurely. Queen Elizabeth's own passing at the ripe old age of 93 also, I think, provoked a sort of global outpouring. You heard as many messages from global leaders expressing sympathy at the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, just as many as you heard, expressing their sympathies and their official condolences at the passing of Pope Francis. It's a tough one. I think that other than that monarchy, I'm trying to think, other sort of global institutions that inspire that kind of, maybe the Kennedy White House might have done something, and Jackie O in particular, Jacqueline Onassis in her role in the, making the White House a public institution. That's a tough one. Italy, I think, has a great leg up on everyone, because not only does it have the Vatican and the papacy, it's got Stanley Tucci.
And just finally on this, Giorgia, Italy will, of course, be hosting this weekend what is obviously first and foremost a papal funeral, but realistically, as everybody well understands, will just be a huge, huge, huge diplomatic event. Is it possible to, I guess, have any idea of what kind of image Italy in general and Giorgia Meloni in particular as Prime Minister will be trying to project?
I mean, Giorgia Meloni and this Pope had going back to the soft power. Giorgia Meloni was well aware of the soft power of Pope Francis. In fact, she asked him to attend the G7, the first Pope in history to ever attend the G7, where not only he had the opportunity to share his views on AI or disabilities, but also had one-to-one with Biden, for instance, about migrants and human dignity, which is very important. And so the list of leaders who want to be seen there is quite long. Notably, I think the silence sometimes is louder than words. And at this very moment, and after the Easter message on Sunday, the fact that Netanyahu has not even commented on the death after clearly on his message was all an appeal on humanity because, attacks on schools, hospitals or humanitarian workers are not a target but are on people. So these are words that clearly have hit the right nerve on Netanyahu. And similarly, other leaders who pretend, even Trump, the first, who took up to Twitter to say he was a good man, but then we don't know whether is what he thinks and or whether he will learn. We know that there was a very strong dispute on the immigration themes with Donald Trump and with J.D. Vance, who paradoxically is the last leader who saw him alive.
Giorgia Scaturro and Charles Hecker, thank you both for joining us. Now, this Thursday, the latest edition of Monocle magazine will hit a newsstand near you. In that issue, you'll find an interview with Nicholas Berggruen, founder of the eponymous global philosophy and governance think tank, the Berggruen Institute. For his reporting on that, Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid also spoke with the Institute's executive vice president, Nils Gilman, about the failings of globalization and the Institute's proposal for a new framework of governance they call the planetary. Gunnar began by asking Nils to explain the work of the Berggruen Institute.
Yeah, so the Berggruen Institute is a nonprofit based in Los Angeles, California. We were founded about 15 years ago, and we're primarily interested in two broad topics, and especially the intersection between them, one of which is philosophy, and the other of which is governance. And the way those two things come together is we're particularly interested in novel and interesting ideas about how to improve governance systems across the world, really at every level of governance, from local systems to regional systems to national systems, even to planetary scale governance systems.
Yeah, well, and speaking of planetary, you recently held a planetary summit in Venice back in November, where you were sort of introducing to a broad audience and also working out with a host of speakers this concept of the planetary. Can you explain what this is?
Sure. Well, first of all, the planetary as a concept is basically meant to contrast to the idea of the global. Global, as in global governance or globalization, refers to the flows of goods and services around the world that humans intentionally move around the world, basically for commercial reasons. It could be ideas, it could be money, it could be people, but it's all human stuff that we're moving around the globe. The planetary refers to systems that are biogeochemical, related, deeply integrated into the planet, that also involve planetary flows, and that often may be being perturbed by human action, but that are not the direct intentional result of human activity. So things like, increasing carbon in the atmosphere, the disruption of the nitrogen cycle, space junk, oceanic plastics. A lot of these things are environmental in nature, but it also could include things like technological risks, things of that sort. And so we become particularly interested in the question of how can we effectively govern these systems, because currently the current architecture of governance for managing these kinds of planetary scale challenges is not working. And we believe it's not working because the actual institutional infrastructure is not fit for purpose. So that's what the planetary concept is. And the big summit that we held in Venice in November was meant to sort of generalize this idea and really broker a conversation between people in the sciences who are working on the technical aspects of it, in the philosophical dimension who are thinking about the kind of conceptual implications of this, and then on the governance side, and trying to get those three kind of groups into dialogue with one another.
And I just want to dig down a little bit more into the globalization question, because I think for a lot of people, if they immediately meet this concept that you guys have of the planetary, they would read it as simply almost a more radical globalization, or globalization 2.0, or globalization with some new bells and whistles. What would you say to sort of really strongly differentiate what would the planetary concept actually bring governance that globalization didn't already?
Obviously, the particular political moment we're in right now, maybe for the last 5 years, maybe longer than that, maybe for 25 years, there's been a growing backlash against globalization. And I think that the political backlash in countries all over the world against globalization has really been about the sort of social dislocation effects that globalization has produced. Lots of industries in countries all over the world have been disrupted. There's been a bit of a cultural backlash against the flows of people around the world, but those remain all things that you could potentially revise, right? You could say, okay, we're not going to have as much trade. We're going to move towards more national or regional economies. We're going to close our borders to other human beings. And regardless of what one feels about that, phenomena we refer to as planetary phenomena are simply not amenable to that kind of shutdown. The effects of pandemics, as we saw, countries tried to shut their borders and shut the pandemic out back in 2020, and it abjectly failed almost everywhere. So it's simply not viable to treat the flows of planetary things as things that you can just arbitrarily decide by politics are not going to be flowing around the planet. Those kinds of challenges are going to be with us, regardless of whether we choose to deglobalize our economic and political systems. And what we're trying to do is stage an intentional conversation about what kind of system we want to deal with these planetary challenges, which you can't escape any other way. We're going to have to figure out a way to govern them. And if we don't do that in an open conversation, it's going to happen just willy-nilly by force of, whoever chooses to step up with their own technical expertise or financial power to do it.
How do you imagine yourself and your colleagues and people that are like-minded actually being able to convince policymakers and world leaders of making these kinds of changes? Because a lot of what you're asking for seems to be basically nation states, sovereign nations, giving up a lot of their sort of sovereignty for these planetary purposes.
Yeah, that's a great question. It certainly is a challenge to sovereignty. These kinds of planetary flows don't respect sovereign borders. They have, they're not human things, and they don't respect the human convention of sovereignty. So sovereignty is already being blown up in some sense by the physical fact of these biogeochemical systems being disrupted. Here, I think there's a very important lesson to be drawn from previous eras and ways in which countries have been willing, even the most powerful countries in the world, have been willing to give up slices of their sovereignty when they saw a severe enough existential threat on the horizon. Imagine if there's a pandemic, perhaps even a bioengineered pandemic, that kills not 0.1% of the people who got it, as with the COVID pandemic, but kills 5% of the people who get it, or 15% of the people who get it, or as with the bubonic plague when it first arrived across the old world, 30% of the people who get it. I mean, these things have happened in the past, right? And technological risks and the very fact that there are 8 billion human beings buzzing and blooming around the planet means that those risks are only increasing. And in fact, if we don't set up systems to control these risks, a catastrophe of that scale is just a matter of if and not when. Now, my hope in starting this conversation, our hope at the Institute in starting this conversation today, is that we can get blueprints in place and perhaps even make progress on this without having to have a catastrophe of the sort of the bubonic plague where, a third of humanity dies, without having a climate catastrophe, an acute climate catastrophe that kills tens of millions of people in a matter of weeks. Things that have been unthinkable in the past in terms of giving up slices of sovereignty have happened over time, but it's usually been precipitated by either a calamity like a world war or the prospect of a calamity, as with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That was Nils Gilman, Executive Vice President of the Berggruen Institute, speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlund. And you can read more on that story in the next issue of Monocle, available this Thursday. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Giorgia Scaturro and Charles Hecker. Thanks also to Rajesh Merchandani at the top of the show. Today's show was produced by Anita Riota and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.